I'm coming in hot on this episode of Battle Guides featuring Kallistar. Kallistar is a stance-switching powerhouse who has a lot of damage, but also has a lot of defensive stats. However, that does mean that she is highly stance-reliant, loses a lot of life, and kind of has ranged problems. Kallistar's unique ability is Form of Disaster. Kallistar starts the game as human form, and using her ignition style she can become elemental form, while using her flare style she can become human again. During the anti-phase, depending on which form Kallistar is in, she gains different bonuses. As a human, she gains Soak 1 for the rest of the beat. As an elemental, she gains Power plus 2 and Priority plus 2. However, she does lose 1 life because of this. This unique ability is amazing. Notice how she just gets a lot of good stats because of this thing. Power plus 2 and Priority plus 2. Other characters have to spend a lot just to get those stats, and Kallistar doesn't even have terrible styles to boot. So this means that all of her attacks become completely powerhouse options if she's elemental form. However, on the flip side, she has a very defensive human form. This human form is very interesting because it gains Soak 1, meaning that if she does trade against you, you don't deal as much damage to her. Note that many, and in fact I think almost every single one of her styles, change effects depending on whether you're human or elemental. So from what I've seen, elemental form effects on her styles often confer offensive bonuses, like moving the opponent around to get them in range for your attacks, or getting added range to your attacks. On the other hand, human form bonuses involve things like getting extra defense and dodging opponents. Kallistar is a stance switcher by trade. This is your first introduction to stance switchers, I think. I don't think Devastation had a real stance switcher, because stance switchers usually mean you have only 2 stances and change between them very frequently. This is very interesting because the best way to use Kallistar is to obviously be in the right stance at the right time. Given that her human form gives her a lot of defense and her elemental form gives her a lot of offense, she can actually do a lot of things that other characters wish they could ever do. She's almost as strong as any dedicated powerhouse, and her defensive options are almost as good as any defensive characters. But what's the catch? It's simple. She can't be both at the same time. This is very important. So it's about knowing how to get into the right stance at the right time, and knowing when to take advantage of your elemental form very well, especially since you lose 1 life every beat you are in elemental form. This means that if your opponent does dash you off it, and trust me, they will, you might lose a lot of life in the process. So be very careful with your elemental form, especially because Kallistar doesn't have a lot of hit confirm, and any range she does have has minimum range attached to it. So be very careful about that. First up, let's start off with the 2 styles that the unique ability actually mentions. First off is Ignition. Ignition allows Kallistar to enter her elemental form, which is very important if you ever want to get a lot of damage out. And as Kallistar, trust me, you will deal a lot of damage. Now, Ignition is very interesting because if you are elemental, this thing gains bonus stats, which means that elemental gets even scarier when you use this with it. That is very good. Because, well, it's a big payout attack, that's simply it. If you can cycle long enough or stay in elemental form long enough, this can turn into a big payout attack that allows you to deal a lot of damage really fast. However, it's not her best use of this style, as oftentimes you want to keep it so that you can get the ability to turn back into an elemental when you desperately need it. Aside from that, note that using it in elemental form immediately makes you lose 3 life, for the cost of, getting the extra bonus power. So if you feel like your opponent doesn't have a dash or has no way to dodge you, use it only then, because if they do dash this attack, considering that it's not that fast, even in elemental form, you will lose a lot of life in the process, and oftentimes that's not worth it. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly suggest pairing it with Drive if you're planning to use it for elemental forms, or pair it with a dash because it safely allows you to become elemental, especially since human form doesn't have the best stats. Now, if something lets you turn elemental, something has to turn you back into a human, and that's what Flare is for. Flare is a very interesting card because as an elemental, it just reverts you back to being human. But it does have an innate power +3. As an elemental, you get priority +2 and power +2, which means that this is technically a power +5, priority +2. If you hit with this thing, you will deal on average 8 damage. That's almost half somebody's life, and this isn't even an overdrive attack. So if you do hit them with this thing, it's a very, very good way to end your elemental streak. Remember, as Kallistar, it's about human, and then transition into elemental, and then transition back into being human. Staying elemental throughout the entire game makes you heavily predictable as, well, not a lot of the elemental effects really differ. They're all just a bunch of extra range and move the opponent closer to me, which is very bad if your opponent is a smart cookie. So, this is a great way to end your elemental streak, possibly dealing +5 damage to somebody's face and making them cry. On the other hand, if you're human and you use this, it gains an added benefit of priority +3. That might not sound like a lot, but it's very, very good, especially because it's on human form. In human form, opponents don't expect you to have a lot of stats, but this thing gets power +3 and priority +3 at the cost of 3 life, and your human form suddenly gets a lot of stats. This can surprise opponents often, as it will scare them and they're like, oh, human form doesn't have a lot of stats, and then suddenly, bam, they get hit for 6. That's what this is used for. When you're elemental, it's a great way to end your streak, and if you're human, it's a great way to surprise opponents who don't think that you have enough stats. Now, when it comes to attacks, you want to pair this thing with lots of hit confirm. So Drive and the unique base Spellbolt are very good candidates. Next up is Caustic. Caustic changes heavily depending on whether you're human or not. If you're a human, it gives you Soak 2, which is really good because you innately have Soak 1, meaning that this thing gives you Magical Stun Guard 3. Not even then, it's Soak, which is freaking great, meaning that you trade up on your opponent almost all the time. With the +1 power, pretty freaking good. On the other hand, if you're elemental, this thing stuns on hit, which is okay, seeing as being elemental means that not only do you get +3 in power, you also get +1 priority, which is really, really, really good with this style. However, remember that it has no hit confirm. So it's a big problem when you're elemental, as you want to be fast, but you don't want to use Spellbolt or Shot since they're too slow. On the other hand, being human, this is a really good card because you can just pair it with Shot. So when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend pairing it with Shot if you're human, and Drive if you're elemental. Next up is Blazing! You blaze with this card as elemental because it gives you range, and when you're human, it allows you to dodge opponents after activating. See, this thing is very interesting because it's kind of one of her worst styles, seeing as Kallistar can't really capitalize on that range +0 to 1 very well. See, the magic number for range is again 1 to 3, and all this does is turn your melee attacks into 1 to 2, which is oftentimes not enough to counter a burst, so I'm a bit iffy on that. So when it comes to using this, I highly recommend using it as human, because the after activating effect synergizes well with dash, allowing you to dash over opponents who are literally almost on the opposite end of the board, which is very good considering that a lot of opponents can use that to their advantage to dodge your dashes by using some form of really long range, high damaging shot attack. When it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend pairing this with dash as human form, because again, the bonus range and dash is amazing, and if you must use it on elemental, I suggest using Drive, because Drive is like the fastest thing you can do. Next up is Volcanic. As an elemental, it allows you to lower your opponent's priority by 2 next beat, and if you're human and to beat y'all, you can teleport to any space on the board. this is pretty good, considering that the range is +2 to 4, which makes up for Kallistar's innate lack of range, because you can see that a lot of her styles have +0 range, which is backbreaking sometimes. When it comes to using this, remember that the minimum range is a big problem, so because drives can mess you up, or start of beat advances can mess you up, but since you're Kallistar, you have enough stats to compensate for that. As Elemental, this thing has +2 power and +2 priority, so you have no problem, and as human, you can just pair it with a Grasp. However, the Elemental benefit is not that good, because if you're Elemental form, oftentimes anyone you're fighting is going to be slower than you anyway, so doing that is not necessarily the best thing, but it can be useful for countering dashes, which is a great setup if you want to use your Flare the next turn. So for example, you do Volcanic something into Flare something, that almost always guarantees that the opponent won't be able to dodge your Flare. Seeing as Flare's highest priority is priority 7 or priority 8, a -2 priority on the opponent can lead to their dash becoming a 7, which is super good because, well, that's lower than your highest priority. On the other hand, if you're human, it's a very good setup thing. It allows you to dodge, well, position yourself properly for the next beat, especially if you plan on using something like a Spellbone, or plan turning Elemental, then whacking opponents close up, because Elemental is more of a melee-oriented form. When it comes to attack pairs, I highly suggest you pair this with Strike and Grasp, because those things need range. And finally, we have Spellbone. Spellbone is a near full board range attack that has mediocre stats but has minimum range. The thing is that if you're human, you can lower their power, and if you're Elemental, you can move them around and brawl with them. This is very good because, again, Kallistar lacks a lot of range, and she has a lot of range problems. And this is pretty good, aside from the fact that it has minimum range. It's very good as Elemental, and it's very okay as human, though I like it more as Elemental, because human's not fast enough to use its effects properly. When it comes to attack pairs, this thing pairs well with Caustic and Flare for pretty obvious reasons. Kallistar's 2 overdrive finishers are Supernova and Chain of Destruction. Supernova is a giant finishing overdrive finisher. Basically, it has 1 to 2 range, technically 10 power, technically 7 priority. This thing can basically kill a lot of people, especially if their dash and burst are down. Do be careful though, because if this thing whiffs, you die and lose the game immediately. Note that you can only use it in Elemental form, so that's a bit of a problem if you're not in the correct form. On the other hand, we have Chain of Destruction, which is only usable in human form. This thing allows you to basically repeat the attack over and over again by spending life. And it does have awkward range, mediocre power, mediocre speed. But the thing is, you can only use overdrives when you have 7 or below life, meaning that at most, you can get 12 damage out of this thing. Though in most cases, because of math, you can only get 8 damage, which is mediocre at best. Those overdrives are pretty freaking okay, especially if you want to finish off your opponent. However, remember, you are Kallistar, and your elemental attacks might as well be overdrives all of their own. They're freaking amazing. They hurt people so much. So I don't really find value in her overdrive finishers. Instead, I really value cancels as Kallistar because it allows you to get rid of dashes, which are the bane of your resistance because your big payout attacks hurt if they dash you. On the other hand, you can also use Pulse. Gelser is a character who strangely has range problems because a lot of her styles have no freaking hit confirm on them. They're just big stats. So, bringing people near you while you're in elemental form is a big thing and can win you games. Let's move on to the part that everybody loves. Gelser Advanced Strategies and Combos. Gelser Advanced Strategies can be simplified into 3 simple things. Number 1, stance switching. Number 2, trading. Number 3, punishing dashes. Number 1 is very simple. Stance switching. Just make sure that you are in the right stance at the right time. If your opponent dashes you and you're not in elemental form, that's kind of a bad thing because you want to be in elemental form when their dash is down. So oftentimes you want to match your ignition with their dash if you can, as much as possible. On the other hand, if your opponent does have their strongest attacks in their hand and you feel like your elemental form might not do so much, or if you feel like you're losing too much health on your elemental form, especially if your opponent has dashed you and they're now really far away, remember, elemental form doesn't have a lot of range. I highly suggest that you just switch back to human form because you don't want to waste your turns losing life while trying to catch up with the opponent. So here's a simple heuristic. If the opponent is near you and doesn't have a lot of dash options, you want to be elemental. If the opponent is far away and or threatens you with multiple dash options, you want to be human to preserve your life. That's it. It's that simple. It's not that hard, but it does take some forethought. Remember, you only change stances at the end of the beat, so you actually have to think a beat ahead before you change your stances. Enough games and practice will inform you, and there's nothing much I can do other than to tell you to play more games. Number 2, making trades worth it. Make your trades freaking worth it. As a character who loses her life, literally, by trying to deal damage to opponents, you have to make your trades worth it. Oftentimes, you don't want your opponents to just dash you or deal more damage than you deal to them. Remember, you lose life. So factor that into how much damage you're trading for. So be very careful about that when using Kallistar, because even her big payout attacks end up with her losing a total of 4 life in 1 turn, and that's without the opponent hitting her. So if the opponent has a lot of stun guard or a lot of defensive stats, you may want to avoid using those big payout attacks. That's pretty much it. Just make sure you make your trades worth it. Make sure that every beat, they lose more life than you do. And don't take unnecessary risks because, again, that's not a trade that's worth it. 4 life for doing nothing is never worth it. Ever. Ever. And finally, dash punishment. Dash punishment is amazing as Kallistar. If the opponent dashes you while you're in elemental form, or if they dash you as human form, punish them by whacking them with the strongest thing you can. Oftentimes, most characters have no way of backing out of that once the opponent has dashed. Much like how Clockwork is for Cadenza, as Kallistar, your entire elemental form is just that. You dangle it above your opponent's head and threaten them to dash. You're like, dash me brah, dash me brah, dash me brah, and when they dash you, you mess them up. Simple as that. Again, it takes a bit of practice and forethought, but I'm sure you guys can do it. Finally, let's move on to some Kallistar combos. Number 1, Caustic Shot Human Form. Oh, amazing. Effective stun card 5 soak 3. Amazing. Amazing. Deals 4 damage. Amazing. All I can say about it. Nothing else. Number 2, Flare Drive Elemental Form. Oh, another amazing attack. That is super risky, but if it does hit, you deal 3 plus 3 plus 2. 8 damage. At what priority, I might add? Priority 6. Oh, it's like an overdrive. It's like a better version of Supernova. I swear, it's amazing. It'll wreck things. It'll make people cry. And that's really amazing. You use this kind of like clockwork shot in a sense. You scare opponents into dashing this thing. Then when they dash you, that's when you use this thing. Because that's just how good it is. And finally, how do you get to elemental form safely? It's with a safe ignition dash. I know it doesn't seem like the best use for your ignition, especially since elemental form can get some use out of it. But if you are in human form and need a fast and safe way to get into elemental form, especially if your opponent is a stat beast, this is the way to go. Ignition dash, elemental, mess people up. Simple as that. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Battle Guides. Oh, I love Kallistar. She has big numbers and she's about finesse, quite frankly, because unlike other big numbers characters, she actually has a way to mitigate her big number weaknesses. Her lack of range is easily made up for by switching to human and just being defensive and positioning correctly. On the other hand, as a human, her lack of stats can be easily remedied by using Ignition and then messing people up. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. I love Kallistar. If you're still listening to this, an extra tip I give you guys is that Elemental form is a super low range form, while Human form seems to have a lot of range for some obscure reasons. Mostly because Shot is barely a good play when you're Elemental because it's not fast enough to matter. But as a human, since you have defenses, Shot is amazing. So think about that and play around your bases as well when you're Kallistar. This episode, I'm sorry there was no Armory episode in the previous week. I was overwhelmed with school and because I just couldn't go through all those cards. There's so many trinkets and so many equipments that I was just overwhelmed, and I think I need some time to think about them. Next week will be finals week for me for school, so I'm not sure whether I can get the Armory out then. So I hope you guys are patient with me, and thank you very much for being patient because I love doing these videos for you guys, and I just hope that you guys like watching it too. Aside from that, there's a typhoon that hit my place. My place is okay, but it might mess with my internet or something like that, so this video might be out late. I hope not. Aside from that, there's not much else to say. Don't forget your special action, and thank you, World of Indines. Thank you, and good night.